So I was just reading about this 13th century BC Hittite tablet, and my mind is completely blown. It's literally the perfect example of what happens when you look beyond the text, right? Like, seeing exactly what happens when hard science and ancient legends actually collide. I mean, we all know the epic stories. Homer's Iliad, the Dodds, those legendary battles. But finding actual, physical breadcrumbs in the dirt that line up with those myths, that is just something else entirely.
And what's so crazy about the wording on this specific Hittite document, it's known as the Alexandru Treaty, by the way, is that it records this political relationship between two kings. And it specifically mentions a king named Alexandru who ruled a city called Wilusa. Just say those names out loud a few times. Wilusa. It is incredibly close to Wilios, which is the older form of Ilios, Homer's name for Troy. And Alexandru? It sounds suspiciously like Alexandros, which was the other name for the Trojan prince Paris. Now, look, we don't have absolute definitive proof that Alexandru is the historical Paris, but that linguistic echoing across thousands of years, it's just wild to think about.
But the real kicker is what we actually find in the dirt, because archaeologists have excavated the site in modern-day Turkey that we identify as Troy, and the physical evidence tells this absolutely fascinating, brutal story. We see a large, fortified city that was clearly prepping for a massive siege. I mean, they had provisions heavily stockpiled. We see burnt buildings, human remains everywhere, arrowheads, slingstones. So a major violent conflict definitely happened here. But, and I always want to be completely honest about the limits of what we actually know, we have zero physical proof of a 10-year-long war. There are no inscriptions naming Achilles, and yeah, definitely no evidence of a literal giant wooden horse.
Now, if you want to see just how exact this kind of detective work can get, look at the medieval Norse sagas of Vinland. We're talking the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. Back in the 1960s, archaeologists basically proved these stories were grounded in reality when they excavated the Norse settlement at Lanzo Meadows up in Newfoundland. They even found these butternut shells there, which proves the Norse actually sailed much further south. But here is the massive mystery. Traditional radiocarbon dating is, well, it's a bit blurry. It gives us a pretty wide range of dates. So how on earth did scientists recently figure out the exact, precise year they arrived?
Okay, the answer lies in this incredibly cool phenomenon called a Miyake event. Back in the years 992 or 993 CE, the Earth was bombarded by an intense solar proton storm, and it acted like this global radioactive stamp. This massive burst of cosmic rays caused a really sharp spike in atmospheric carbon-14, which was then instantly absorbed by growing trees everywhere on the planet and locked directly into their tree rings for that specific year.
And this just shows the sheer crazy power of modern chronometric dating. Researchers took discarded pieces of wood that were actually cut by the Norse at Lanzoad Meadows, pieces that still had their outer bark attached, which is key. They found that exact 993 CE radiation spike inside the wood. Then, they simply counted the rings outward from that spike to the bark edge. Exactly 28 rings later, they hit the bark, which means the wood was cut in the 29th year after the storm. They pinpointed the exact year the Norse were chopping wood in North America, 1021 CE, literally down to the year.
That kind of technological magic actually brings me to LiDAR. If you haven't heard of this, it is basically digital deforestation. You mount a sensor on an aircraft and fire up to 150,000 laser pulses per second at the ground. And while most of them hit the jungle canopy, a tiny fraction, like maybe 2 to 5%, slips right through the leaves and hits the forest floor. Then, algorithms step in and strip away every single data point associated with the plant. It leaves this perfect bare earth 3D model. It reveals ancient, overgrown structures that are completely invisible to the naked eye.
Just think about how crazy this is for a second. In 2024, there was this PhD student who was literally on page 16 of a Google search. We've all been there, right? He found an old 2013 environmental LiDAR data set from Mexico that was originally just meant for monitoring forest carbon. He reanalyzed it, and bam, he stumbled onto Valeriana, a completely unrecorded, massive classic period Maya city with pyramids, plazas, reservoirs. It was home to up to 50,000 people, just sitting there on a server waiting for someone to peel back the digital leaves.
But sometimes science doesn't just uncover new cities. It actually corrects massive historical typos. We've all learned in school that the Hanging Gardens were built in Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar II, but archaeologists could never find a single trace of them there. Well, a British academic named Stephanie Dawley figured out why. After 18 years of deciphering cuneiform scripts, she realized a 1920s mistranslation completely muddied the waters.
We have literally been looking in the wrong city for a century. The gardens were actually built 300 miles away in Nineveh by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. And what's truly wild is the physical evidence backing this up. At Nineveh, we actually have Sennacherib's own inscriptions where he describes building an unrivaled palace and a wonder for all peoples. Even better, recent excavations have found traces of a massive 50-mile aqueduct system. It's so huge it literally looks like a modern highway from the air. The ancient texts even describe bronze water-raising screws, predating Archimedes by like 400 years, that they used to pull water up all day to maintain this artificial mountain landscape. The engineering perfectly matches the legend.
It really just makes you take a breath and marvel at the sheer scale of deep time. I mean, we rely so heavily on written text, but human memory might actually be the most incredible data storage system we have. When you look at geological timelines, like sea levels shifting thousands of years ago, or these massive volcanic eruptions, you would think any human account of those events would be lost forever. But oral traditions are completely challenging that assumption. And the crucial point here is how perfectly these stories align with the geology. Take Crater Lake in Oregon, for example. The oral tradition of the Klamath people describes this violent war between the spirit of the below world and the spirit of the above world. They describe the earth trembling, red-hot rocks being hurled through the sky, and this terrible darkness blocking out the sun. Well, geologists now know this perfectly describes the catastrophic VEI-7 eruption, which is one of the most explosive types possible of Mount Mazama about 7,700 years ago. Archaeologists even found ancient moccasins and tools buried directly under the volcanic ash. So this legend? It's a completely accurate 7,700-year-old eyewitness account.
And this timeline goes even deeper in Australia. Indigenous Australians have coastal submergence stories that perfectly describe when offshore islands like Kangaroo Island were still connected to the mainland. Now, geologists know those land bridges flooded when ice sheets melted, reaching modern sea levels about 7,000 years ago. But these stories, they date back up to 10,000 years. How do you keep a story accurate for 400 generations? It turns out they maintained a strict, kin-based cross-checking system. Specific family members were culturally obligated to audit the storyteller and correct any errors, which is how they preserved perfect geographic records for an unbelievable 10 millennia.
But you're probably wondering right now, does science validate all these ancient stories? Or does it sometimes act as a massive lie detector? Because it is one thing to confirm an oral tradition, right? But it's another thing entirely when physical evidence totally dismantles a famous legend.
Take the biblical story of Sodom, for example. A few years ago, there was this highly publicized paper claiming the city of Tal el-Hammam was destroyed by a cosmic comet airburst, supposedly validating the biblical catastrophe. They claimed to find shocked quartz and melted pottery, but geologists stepped in and totally dismantled it. The melted evidence? Yeah, it was just regular domestic pottery kilns. The destruction layer? Standard earthquake activity in normal house fires. The paper even had manipulated images and was officially retracted. So science doesn't just bend to fit the myth. And you kind of have to laugh a bit at how blatant some of these historical fabrications are. Take King Arthur's supposed grave at Glastonbury Abbey. Back in 1191, monks suddenly discovered this massive oak coffin with giant skeletons and a very convenient lead cross claiming it was Arthur and Guinevere in Avalon. Well, physical analysis exposed this as the ultimate medieval tourist trap. The monks had just suffered a massive fire and desperately needed to raise funds to rebuild the abbey, so they just literally fabricated King Arthur's grave as a publicity stunt.
I think it's pretty fair to say we are living on the very edge of history right now. These ancient legends aren't just literal verbatim truths, but they aren't complete fictions either. They are incredibly complex cultural memories. Real natural disasters, real wars, and real engineering marvels were processed by the human experience and packaged into myths. And now, we are finally developing the right tools, from cosmic radiation tracking to firing lasers in the jungle to actually decode them.
It really makes you question what parts of our own modern history might look like myths to people thousands of years from now. I'd actually like to know what you think. When it comes to preserving the truth over thousands of years, do you trust written texts that can be forged or mistranslated, or these heavily audited oral traditions that survive for hundreds of generations? Let me know in the comments. And hey, if this was interesting to you, giving it a like really helps more people find the discussion. Make sure to subscribe to stick around for the next real mystery at the edge of science and history. See you next time.